It is my pleasure to be here with you all. It says in the Word of God that he who calls you is faithful and he will surely do it. Also says, "For you shall go out in joy and be led forth in peace. The mountains and the hills before you shall break into singing, and all the trees of the field shall clap their hands." And I truly believe that it is only by the grace of God that I'm standing here today in this place. And there is nothing that I have within me that is of worth, and there's nothing that makes me any better than any of you here in this room. And so I want to go on to share with you how I came to walk with the Lord and share the things that I've seen in heaven and in hell. And so to begin, I was born in the very south of Korea in a place called Samcheonpo. And Samcheonpo is known to be a place where you end up after getting lost from your original destination. And it's not a very positive reference. And although I didn't like to hear such phrases in regards to my birthplace, what was I to do? It was my hometown and I was born there. And at Samcheonpo, Jinju, my father was the section chief who was in charge of the maintenance of the education office. And he worked to construct and to build the school. And for every place that he had to go for his work, our family moved with him. And I spent my elementary, high school, and middle school years at Jinju. And for college, I went on to study in Seoul. And I'm not sure how long it has been since all of you have come to Korea. But for me, it's already been 34 years since I graduated from university and I've been here. And already a time of 30 years has quickly passed by. And why did I graduate from Ewha University, Women's University, and what was the reason that I attended this university? I went with a pure and innocent heart, and I believe that the Lord uses those with a pure heart. Amen. And so the reason why I attended Ewha University was because during my middle school years, I had heard of a doctor by the name Schweitzer. My young heart in 4th grade was moved by stories of him going to Africa and aiding the poor and the sick. And so I decided to become a person like him, to become a person like Schweitzer. And so I applied to Ewha Women's University. And I was studious. I went up to surgical studies, and I was even more studious at the top of the class. And to become a person like Schweitzer, I became infatuated with my studies, and I slept a mere 3 hours a day. I was never able to attend the university's festivals. I never went to watch a movie at a theater, and I didn't have an inkling of my own personal life. All that I did was study. And it was about 3 years into my studies. We studied for a total of 6 years. And at this university, there are only women. And right now, all my colleagues that have graduated, their lives are so hectic, working as doctors, and they're so consumed with making money. And after I met Jesus, the people that I felt sorry for, that I felt pity for, were rather my own colleagues. And in my 3rd year, I just happened to ask someone sitting next to me, "Why did you come to Ewha Women's University?" And what my friend replied was saying that my mother, my father, they told me to study hard, to graduate from Ewha Women's University, to make lots of money, to receive recognition from society. And I was told that that was the best job available. And so that was the reason why she came there to pursue her studies. But for me, my motive for coming to this university was different. And hearing that, I began to come to my senses. And so up until now, for a total of 5 years, in one class, there were 60 of us that studied together. But for the first time, I asked my colleagues why they chose to come here. To my surprise, their reason was to make money. So I asked another person who was sitting next to me, and they also answered with the same response, saying that they came to pursue their studies to make money. So I began to ask others in my class why they decided to come, and to my dismay, their answers were all the same. And from then onwards, the desire that I initially had to become a doctor slowly began to fade away. And I mentioned earlier that I came there to attend that university to pursue my studies with a pure motive and pure intentions at heart. And Although at that time I didn't know Jesus, I viewed life as something precious. It was something rare. And I came to that university with a heart to do volunteer work. We had clinical instructors come, but these clinical instructors, all that they would talk about was money, 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 money. And I began to ask myself, was it a mistake to come here? I came to this university with a heart to become a doctor like Schweitzer, but others came with very differing motives. And so, for one class, there was a doctor who works in the emergency room. And at that time, my country didn't have medical insurance compared to how well developed it is now. But what the doctor said was that if there was a patient at night being rushed in from being in a car accident, so what happens is that you have to know where they had been hit. So you have to have a CT scan to see where the impact was made. But what the doctor was saying was that if the patient does not have the means of paying for the CT scan, regardless of whether they live or die, he said to send them back. And right when I heard that, I realized, oh, I shouldn't become a doctor. And it was rather wrong of me to want to become a doctor. I also began to consider whether my father, he would send an unmarried 22-year-old to Africa to do volunteer work. And I knew that my father wasn't one to permit that. So after hearing the lecture given by the emergency room doctor, I gave up my dreams of becoming a doctor. Oh, I shouldn't become a doctor. And so what I decided then was that I would become a scientist. I had already studied medicine and I could become a scientist and impact the health of mankind. So I went on to graduate from Ewha University and I pursued my master's of physiology at Seoh University. After graduating from there, I went on to pursue more and I came to study at Brown University with the intention and heart to become the very best scientist in all the world. While pursuing this, I thought, why don't I go on ahead to even receive a Nobel Prize? So with this mindset, I came to the States. And if it was anything related to studies, I was the best at it. And I thought, if I sought after research for about 20 years just sitting in a laboratory, wouldn't I be able to receive a Nobel Prize? And to me, there was no reason why I wouldn't be able to receive one. So when I came to America, I was about 30 years old. And even at the age of 30, I didn't believe in Jesus. So when exactly did I encounter Jesus? It was after I came to America. I came to America with the intent of being a recipient of the Nobel Prize, but right now I am a person standing in front of you sharing my testimony of how I came to the Lord. It says that although man might plan his ways, the one who establishes it is the Lord. Coming to America, I still didn't believe in Jesus. I went to the east side to attend Brown University, and because I was studious, I was given a scholarship of $30,000. And I'm not sharing this to boast that I was smart or intellectual or anything like that. So I got on a plane, and just after flying for 13 hours, I arrived in America. But right after I arrived in America, all of my surroundings are so different. The first thing I noticed that was different was the food. There was no kimchi. There was no Korean soybean paste. The kinds of food that I found here in the East was steak, meat without marinade, and butter spread on bread. And those are the only kinds of foods that I found in my dormitory. And with the sudden change of food, I began to lose weight because I wasn't able to properly consume and digest any of the foods found here. And I wasn't even able to enter into the cafeteria because I couldn't stand the smell of the food. So the only thing that I consumed was, they had this Japanese ramen noodle, and it was 4 packets for $1. And I'm not sure if they still sell it for $1, but I ate this ramen with Tabasco sauce, and that was all I ate for about 2 weeks' time. I wanted to eat something spicy, I wanted to eat kimchi, I wanted to taste some Korean soybean paste, but I couldn't. But one day, it was a Sunday, It was the Lord's Day. And at that time, since I didn't believe in Jesus, I didn't call it the Lord's Day, and I just called it Sunday. So on this day, I was just sitting there in my dorm, and someone came knocking at my door. She was younger than me, but she was a senior compared to me, having been studying at Brown for a longer time. So she was knocking at the door, and she came looking for me exactly 2 weeks' time when I was just going through so much homesickness. And what she mentioned was that there was a Korean church nearby. So she went along to say that after we have worship and sermon for about an hour, that the church provided a full buffet of Korean food. I don't know what it is about the East Side, but there's no Korean market, no Korean restaurants in sight. But right when the church was mentioned, I thought, oh, a church. Being a person that had been actively persecuting the church. So having been ruled by medical knowledge that I have, whenever talk of religion came up, I was so quick to dismiss it, and I just did not believe it. What I held on to was my comprehension of the Big Bang Theory and scientific knowledge and just different opinions that I acquired over the years of studying. But with this offer of Korean food, I obliged and I decided to go to church. So after an hour of the pastor giving his sermon, I knew that I would be able to eat Korean food. So even while the pastor was giving his sermon, all that I could think of was food. I wasn't intaking or listening to anything that the pastor was saying. My ears were really not open to hear anything. Even at Ewha University, they have this time set apart for chapel, but because I didn't believe in Jesus, all the songs that they sang, it had no meaning, it had no importance to me whatsoever. So for about a total of 8 weeks, I was attending church, and the only motivation that I had was for the food and being able to speak with others in my mother tongue. But looking back on it now, I had an older sister who had been praying for me about 6 years. And looking back, it wasn't that I was given an opportunity to study abroad by chance, but the Lord had heard the prayers of my sisters and led me to church in this way. And so coming to Christ in this way, the person that I was most grateful for was the sister who led me spiritually. I was more grateful, even more so than my mother who gave birth to me. I felt so grateful towards my sister. And this person who prayed with tears, with heartfelt tears, for 6 years for my salvation was my sister. My sister attended CCC during her college years, and she took pity on her younger sister attending Ewha University, who knew nothing else but her studies. She always tried to preach the gospel to me, introduce me to different pastors, but when we were eating and conversing, I would just get up and leave. My sister, she'd been through a lot. Whenever things like this happen, one time I told her very clearly that if she were to do this to me again, I would not even call her my sister. Every time we gathered to eat, she would always bring someone to talk about Jesus, and I hated that so much. So for 8 weeks at church, I sat there mindlessly through the sermons, but there was this one moment when the pastor was reading the word and it just hit my heart. And the thought that came into my head was, oh, I thought that God didn't exist, but he does. And it was a miracle for me to have this kind of revelation. Previously, I never even thought or bothered to consider the idea of God even existing. I lived as an atheist, but suddenly I recognized that God existed. From non-existent to existing. This was really a miracle come true for me. I suddenly went from being a non-believer to a believer, and I had never read the Bible before, but I believed everything written in the Word. And I realized that it's true when it says in the Word of God that salvation is a gift from the Lord. And since I began to believe in the Word, I believed in the creation of the world. I had heard of God creating the world, but now I really believed it. Not only did God create the heavens and the earth, but he also created mankind. The God that created the world had also created us. But what did I learn at Ewha University? I learned that the body was profound, it was mysterious, the body was a miracle. And if we take apart and study the different parts of the body, beginning with the genes, to the making of protein, the symmetry of the body giving birth to a child, all these things are equivalent to being a miracle. And it's really not something that can be explained scientifically. And if God created the heavens and the earth, if he created mankind, he would be able to be birthed to earth through Virgin Mary. And the reason why that I refused to hear even the mentioning of Jesus was because I couldn't believe the virgin birth. And according to my scientific learning, egg and sperm has to come together for a child to be born. But for a woman to give birth to a child without sperm was just unbelievable. So whenever there was any talk of Jesus, because of this very small reason, I immediately refused it. But at that moment, realizing that the Lord had created the heavens and the earth, as well as mankind, for God to have a woman give birth to a child without scientific backing was absolutely no difficulty. So I believed in the virgin birth. Being a person of no faith whatsoever, going to church for 8 weeks in a row with the sole purpose of eating food, I was suddenly hit with the word of God, and I began to believe, and it rang throughout my body. There were so many tears that fell at that place, and for 3 years' time, just at the mention of Jesus, I couldn't help but to cry. When God gave me faith to believe, what I realized in that moment was that the greatest sin that man could commit was to deny the existence of God. And this was not revealed to me by anybody, but I recognized this to be a great sin before the Lord. No one told me, but I realized, and I just poured out tears before the Lord. I was someone that said God did not exist. And in that way, by going to church to eat food, I encountered the Lord. And also, there were the 6 years of prayer, persistent, heartfelt prayer that my sister gave unto the Lord. Although I received the Lord with tears, the desire that I had for honor that I held towards the world didn't fade away. I dimly told myself that since I'm now Christian and I need to live for the glory of the Lord, I knew these things, but I didn't have the slightest notion of how I could live for the Lord. I thought that the only way I could live for him was by becoming a world-famous scientist. That to be able to say to the world that even me, a famous scientist, I believe in Jesus. And this was how I thought that I would live for Christ. But this notion, this thought, was also completely changed by the Lord. And so during this time, I went on to UCLA to pursue my postdoctoral studies. I had graduated from Brown with my doctorate degree within 3 years. It is very difficult and very challenging to receive a doctorate degree within 3 years. But all I did during that time was study. And this isn't to illustrate that I was smart, but to illustrate that I was obsessed. I was consumed with my studies. For me, I can't focus on two things. I can only focus on one. If it's just one thing, I can be fully focused and I can give my all to it, but not two things. And at UCLA, the Korean students are gathered around eating and talking. And I was conversing with a fellow student, and there was a male student that passed by. And my friend said he graduated from Seoul University with a degree in economy, and he came to UCLA to receive his doctorates in economy. And I thought, wow, he's even more talented than I am. And it was pointed out that after 3 to 4 months, he would be receiving his PhD in economy from UCLA. And after he received this degree, what he was going to do with it was to go do mission work. And immediately I thought, wow, he must be crazy. This degree, this PhD is gonna go to waste. That student, he eventually went on to do mission work and he died as a martyr on the field. I laughed and I taunted that student. Why would he go on to receive a PhD if he was only going to do mission work after? The degree is just going to waste. And I lived this superficial Christian life. And at a later time, I attended a retreat for university students. It was a 3-night, 4-day retreat up in Big Bear. There were about 140 students seated. It was about 60 to a table, and the student that I made fun of stood up to share his testimony. And he began to share his testimony saying that what he did for the Lord was to fold chairs. Since there are 140 of us, he unfolded each chair before the group arrived and stayed behind to fold them when it was time to leave. And it was a job assigned to 2 people, but the other person wasn't able to make it because they were sick. So it became a job that took about an hour to finish. And he arrived an hour earlier to unfold all the chairs and stay behind an hour later to fold and to organize all of them. And doing that for about 3 months, he shared that it began to irritate him and to make him angry. And the thought that passed through his head was, I am a person who is to receive a PhD in just 3 to 4 months. Why am I doing menial labor? At that moment, what I realized was that we are called to be servants of the Lord. And why is it that I need a PhD to do God's work? I thought, I don't need a PhD to do the work of God, and I began to cry. At that time, I was 36 years old, and for all my life, all that I did was study, study, study. First place, first place, first place, degree, degree, degree. And I got to a point of even receiving my PhD. Being at UCLA, it was always, oh, I'm better than you. And this was all that I did. But when that student went up to share, realizing that there was nothing that said that I needed to do the work of the Lord, it was just my nose and my tears just began to run down my face. It was almost as though a faucet was turned on. I didn't know why I ran so hard to achieve these things, these degrees, when it wasn't something that God was asking of me for. And so after that brother shared that, I was so broken and I didn't hear anything else. I just wanted to go into a corner and cry to my heart's content. What was I running for this whole time? Just wanted to wail, but I couldn't there. So I excused myself saying that I needed to go use the restroom. But when I went outside, they were watching the area so that people don't wander around. But I left saying I needed to go use the restroom. So I left and I went to my room. I closed all the doors, closed all the windows, and I began to weep. I yelled and I wept, not knowing what I had been living for. And with just snot and tears running down my face and yelling, I found myself crying as if like an animal because I lived not knowing my purpose in life. And as I was crying, I wasn't sure if it was a voice that I heard coming from the outside or the inside of the room, but I heard the voice of God. And my name is Sangha, and I heard a voice calling out, my dear Sangha. I immediately knew that it was the voice of God. And I answered, yes. The Lord spoke to me in my mother tongue, Sangha, when you die, you will come join me in heaven. And in tears, I responded, yes, I believe in you, Lord. I will join you in heaven. But all of a sudden, he began to speak in English. And what he said to me was, when you come to heaven, there will be one question that I will ask you. What did you do for me in this life? What did you do for me before you came to join me in heaven? And until that time, There was nothing that I knew how to do other than to study, because that was just all that I did. Other than studying, the only thing that I knew was driving, but I couldn't even drive in the States because I wasn't familiar with the streets, and GPS was non-existent. The thing is that when the Lord asks you a question, you immediately know what your answer is going to be. At that time, I didn't know anything else but studying. I was 36 at the time, and if I lived to be 76 years old, if I were to not get sick with cancer, not get into a car accident, I still had about 40 years of life. I thought, yeah, I could write 100 dissertations, 100 theses. But everyone, in all honesty, even with 40 years, it's really difficult. It's nearly impossible to write 100 dissertations. Even if I tried with all of my might, there was no guarantee that I could achieve this. And when I was asked that question, I immediately thought, I can do everything in my power to write up 100 theses since there was nothing else I know how to do. But in front of me, the Lord appeared, and I'm seeing this vision. So God is seated on a chair, and I'm standing in front of him with 100 dissertations saying, Lord, I wrote 100 theses for you. And as I was seeing this vision, I knew in my heart that this was of no value or meaning to him. The reason why this makes sense is because the Lord created all things. And what scientists do is to take one thing and try to understand how it came to be. And then that's how you receive your doctorates. It's said that there's so much more that you don't know after you receive your doctorate because there's so much out in the world. And it's taking this little fragment and saying, I discovered this. And with that, receiving a doctorate, how would that have any value before the Lord? You know how after we read the newspaper, we recycle it, right? I realized that this was of lesser value to him than even that. And so after the vision ended, I cried more. I was saying, Lord, this doesn't seem like the life that you want me to live. The Lord suddenly gave me a thought. It was a very small thought that came in. Just like how we receive antibiotics through a very slim needle, it was just like that. The thought was this. Sangha, if you were to live the remaining years of your life for me, he said that if you were to live 40 years with the same fervor, the same dedication that you gave to your studies. And then as he was saying that, suddenly I just saw a large basket before my eyes, and inside the basket were just heads of people. Just so many faces. And what this resembled, what this symbolized were souls. And in the basket there are about 30 to 40,000 people. And what the Lord was saying was that if you choose to give me the same fervor and dedication that you gave to your studies, you can lead this many people to me. And as he was saying this, I saw myself again in a vision, just standing before the Lord. In the right hand was the basket holding the souls of the people, and in my left were the 100 theses. It was two different lives that I could choose to live for the Lord, just being compared. And right then, I realized that the kind of life that the Lord wanted of me was not to write theses. Hallelujah. He wanted me to serve. He wanted me to save souls. And as the vision ended, I knew that God was changing me at that moment. And I was 36 at that time, and I cried out, Lord, why didn't you meet me and change me in my 20s? Up until this point in my life, all that I did was study. I never attended a festival, never watched a movie in the theaters, but I lived consumed in my studies. And I was so regretful of the wasted years. So after I finished crying, I opened the door to my room. I think I was crying for about 2 hours. My head was hurting so much. But when I opened the door and I took a breath of air, even the air smelled different. It was so fresh to me. Before this moment, this world was a world of competition to me to see who was better than who. It was always who's presenting their thesis first and who's receiving a Nobel Prize. This was the kind of world that I lived in. But after hearing his voice, and when I opened that door, wow, even the air smelled different, and I began to feel the love that God had for his creation. And from that moment, I began to stop judging others. I had categorized janitors into a cleaning department. Lawyers and doctors were good people that helped better society. But after that encounter, rather, doctors began to seem prideful to me, and the person cleaning the building in a green uniform seemed like the more blessed person because the gospel was for the poor. I became a completely changed person, and my life became a life that was used to further the gospel. The Lord had taught, your life's purpose is not to write dissertations, but it is to save souls. And so after that encounter, all I did on campus was to preach. And later, I was eventually expelled from the university for doing so. And it doesn't sound good to have been expelled by preaching the gospel, but I understand when I hear people like that, because I know that there is a fire inside of their hearts. It's a fire that cannot help but to be shared with others. And the Holy Spirit stirred a fire inside my heart, and I could no longer sit still. And at UCLA, there are many, many Korean students. I spent my time outside meeting people, having lunch with them, and sharing the gospel, leading them to Christ. I shared earlier that I can only focus on one thing. I no longer lived according to my studies, but to a life that now reaches out to souls who don't know Christ. I wrapped up the life that I had in the world. I went up to prayer, spent my time at a prayer mountain, later went on to seminary, and there was a verse that I shared earlier. He who calls you is faithful, and he will surely do it. For you shall go out in joy and be led forth in peace. The mountains and the hills before you shall break forth into singing, and all the trees of the field shall clap their hands. I received this very word and decided to go to seminary. I graduated from Biola University with my degree in theology, and I had a heart to go into missions. But until I heard from the Lord to go, I stayed in LA preaching the word, the gospel, and just planting churches. And since then, it's already been, but it felt like a sin to only plant a church in Koreatown, LA, because there are just so many churches here. So I went to Glendale. I looked into a registry and looked through the various different Kims, Parks, Lees, and I called each person. If they believed in Jesus, I would go on to calling the next person. And if they didn't, I would go to visit them with a bag of rice in hand. And back then it was only $2. I would visit them 3 to 4 times. And in this way, I planted a church from the bottom up. The Lord protected me, watched over me, and caused me to pray throughout these 10 years. And he opened the heavens and hell to me also. I had gone around LA many times preaching the gospel. I went through McDonald's, food marts, and preaching the gospel is all that I knew how to do. And God told me, this is what you are to do.